My name is Dan Finucane, and I'm currently a regent. I love folk music, blues music, and I love singing and playing with other people.
My name is Ian Peoples. I'm a Jesuit regent. I'm kind of a football fanatic. Most of my weekends are spent watching at least a few games. I'm probably one of the biggest Lionel Messi fans.
And we'd like to welcome you to our new show, MAGISTALK.
Imagine that you have a child who is about to go to high school. They want to go to one school that isn't known for the best academics, but it's where all their friends from primary school are going. You, however, want them to go to a high school that you know has a high quality of academics and they will get a good education there. How do you decide which school to go to?
Or imagine that you've been offered a promotion for a new job. And it's a great promotion, but it means that you're going to have to relocate to a different town and you're going to have to relocate your family. Not only that, it's going to mean uprooting from the community that you've spent a lot of time in investing. The promotion is going to advance your career. You're going to make a better salary and be able to provide better financial security for your family, but you also don't really lack for anything right now. Are you going to take the promotion or not?
Finally, imagine getting the opportunity to move out of Belize. Perhaps you have a family member who lives in the United States and they want to help you make that transition into a life in the U.S. So you're considering joining the Belizean diaspora. So how do you decide? Because on the one hand, you would like to have the opportunity to start a new life, a new adventure, but you also love your jewel in the Caribbean. So which one would you do? All three of these scenarios are difficult decisions because they involve choosing between good things. And this is what we call discernment. In the first case, it's the good of allowing your child to continue to deepen friendships they've made in primary school. And in the second, it's choosing between advancing your career, maybe making more money, which are both good things in themselves, but you're also choosing the good of stability for your family. What do you do? And finally, choosing between starting a new life, a new adventure, and leaving the place that you call home. In each of these scenarios, how do you decide?
Each week, as we have in previous episodes, we propose the question, what is God calling me to in my life right now? And nowhere do we feel this challenge more acutely, more significantly than when we have to make a decision, especially, as Ian mentioned, a decision between two things that on the surface seem really good. How do you decide between those two?
On today's episode, we're going to talk about making decisions in a prayerful, discerned way from the spiritual tradition of St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Society of Jesus. We often refer to this spiritual tradition as Ignatian spirituality. Within Ignatian spirituality, whenever we or someone we know is discerning an important decision, we go to what we call the rules for the discernment of spirits, found in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. These rules offer clear guidelines to the work of discernment, which is rooted in a word that means to separate. When we discern, we look at our lives with all our desires, experiences, relationships, and so on, and we try to distinguish where God's Spirit is calling us and where another spirit is drawing us away from God's call. Ignatius called this other spirit the evil spirit or the false spirit. And that tendency in us to reject God's will, that's what this spirit, this false spirit moves in us. And the truth is that we experience movements both from God's Spirit and from the false spirit in our daily lives, every day. When we come to a time of needing to make a decision, we do the work of discernment so we can come to understand what these movements feel like, how they move us, and where they point us toward. By learning about these movements, we can then come to a better understanding of how God is calling us in our lives.
The rules for the discernment of spirits were developed over time by St. Ignatius. And it's important to note that he didn't come up with these in an abstract way. They grew out of experiences that he had himself in his own spiritual life, but also through conversations that he had with men and women around him. And there are two conclusions that we can draw from the development of these rules. The first is that they come from lived experience. So you can study them, and many people do, including Ian and I, but at the end of the day, it's really important to figure out what these rules mean within the context of somebody's experience. How have I experienced these movements within, and how do these rules help me figure out how to discern in the midst of those movements? And so, as we go through the rules today, we'll give experiences that we've had and examples to help illustrate these rules. The second important conclusion to draw is that these rules are best applied not alone in isolation, but with somebody else helping us and guiding us. We don't walk our Christian journey alone. That's the importance of community. And discernment is ultimately a decision that we make, and it's a personal one. But it's one that we don't make privately. The best discernments are made when we ask somebody who's wise. Maybe it's a priest that we know, a religious sister, but somebody in our lives who can help lead us through a difficult decision. Some people intentionally seek out what's called a spiritual director, somebody whose purpose is to accompany them, listen in on their prayer, and help them discern where God is calling them in their life. So today we're going to introduce you to half of the rules for discernment that St. Ignatius developed. The rules that we're going to go over today are more introductory. They're helpful, especially for somebody who hasn't encountered these rules before, and for somebody who wants to grow in their sense of discernment. We'll touch on the other half of the rules for discernment in a later episode.
In all, there are 14 rules that we'll discuss today. We'll break them down into some general themes. The first theme is how the two spirits, the good spirit, the spirit that's coming from God, and the false spirit, act on us, depending on what direction our lives are heading in, whether we're moving from bad to worse or from good to better.
The first rule is that we all have people in our lives that we know of who are immersed in behaviors or maybe even a lifestyle that isn't very good. Or maybe those people were us at one point. Or maybe that person is us right now. And maybe it's not that we're super immersed in a bad life, but maybe there's an area of our life where perhaps we've kind of gotten into some disorder. We could think of various examples of this. People who are immersed in a life of crime, people who drink or party too much. And these are people perhaps that throw their cares to their future self. Or maybe we think, I live a pretty good life right now, but there's this one area that plagues me. Maybe I really love to gossip and I struggle to stop. Or I struggle to tell the truth and I lie a lot. When someone makes bad decisions continuously, the first rule for discernment is about how the false spirit moves people in a particular way. The false spirit makes the person fantasize about how good it would feel to keep doing the thing that they're doing, a vice that they're tied to, that they keep falling into. And the false spirit tends to say things like, "Don't worry so much. A little fun never hurt anybody." Or, "Yeah, you'll get to that at some point, but don't worry about it right now." To use one of the examples that I've mentioned already, maybe I like to party a lot. Perhaps I sometimes think about stopping because I sense that I'm out of control. The false spirit would be the voice saying, sure, Dan, you're fine. You'll take care of that later down the road." Or, "Don't worry about it. It's not like you're out every night, just a couple nights a week. What could be worse than that?" That's how the false spirit works. But God's Spirit, when we're in a place of bad and heading to worse, works in the exact opposite way to the false spirit. God's Spirit works as a kind of sting to the conscience, kind of a prick of the conscience, helps us to experience some uneasiness about our behavior, or we start to question, maybe there's a different way that I could go. This Spirit, the good Spirit, helps us think a little more clearly. Maybe we shouldn't engage in that harmful behavior. If I'm partying a lot, maybe I start to begin feeling a little empty, and I wonder if there's something more to my life. Perhaps I begin to recognize that partying is hurting me and making me feel less than who I am. That's a movement in a different direction, a movement where we begin to sense the good that we might be seeking.
The first rule, as we mentioned, concerns someone who is in a life or behavior where they're moving from bad to worse. The second rule looks at someone who is moving in the opposite direction, who is moving from good to better. And we can think about this by considering a particular example. It would be helpful. So let's consider Maria, who realizes that she has been a huge gossip for many years and she wants to stop. She has often loved the attention and status that she gets from knowing other people's business. But she has begun to see that she has hurt a lot of people around her and she wants to make a change. In this case, the false spirit will try to dissuade her from stopping gossiping by pointing out how difficult it will be after so many years to give up the attention she has received and the power she held, knowing everything about everyone. She might be plagued by a persistent worry that she isn't capable of keeping things to herself, and she might begin to despair that she can actually change. In this case, the false spirit discourages and tries to throw up roadblocks and obstacles for Maria to actually make that change in her life. On the other hand, God's Spirit will be a source of encouragement and strength, of inspiration, and perhaps even a sense of resolve to make a change. Whenever Maria imagines being with others and being a keeper of their secrets, she feels a sense of peace and joy at being someone that her friends and family can trust. She might feel like God is giving her a sense that she can change and that she can find peace in attempting to be more discreet, to be a better, more trusted friend.
It's important to note that the direction that we're going in is really important for these first two rules. It's whether you're going towards evil or towards the good, that's going to help us figure out what the false spirit is doing and what God's Spirit is doing within us. And so for these first two rules, we might ask ourselves these questions. Do I feel like I'm sliding into vices and bad actions? And if so, the first rule would be important to look at. Or do I feel like I'm striving to do better? And in that case, the second rule would be better to consult.
The second theme we want to address are the names of the movements that God's Spirit and the false spirit prompt in us. The movement that we experience when it is God's movement within, we call consolation. And the movement we experience when it is the false spirit moving within us, we call that desolation. Let's unpack these two movements further. The third rule is what we experience spiritual consolation in three typical kinds of experiences. The first is whenever we feel inflamed and drawn into the love of God. When we feel this way, we see everything as a gift given to us by this generous, loving God. We notice that we have a longing for greater closeness and companionship with God, and we feel a sense of abiding peace and joy. Using Maria again as our example, in an effort to stop gossiping, Maria begins to practice lifting others up. She resolves to find the gifts that other people have and to point out those gifts to them in order to really make them feel better about themselves. And as a result, she feels closer to people. Rather than craving the power that gossip seemed to provide, she feels that her life is more full of love as a result of sharing goodwill towards others. This in turn helps her experience God's loving goodness as well. The second experience of spiritual consolation is whenever we feel a sense of sadness when we recognize that though we are sinners, often not faithful to God, God always remains faithful to us in loving mercy. In this case, we might experience tears of gratitude for how God has rescued us from our sinfulness, especially through Jesus' willingness to love us unto death.
This second experience is really important for understanding consolation, because often consolation gets oversimplified and it's seen as equal with happiness. But it's not the same thing as happiness. Rather, consolation is about what direction we're moving in this case, direction towards God. And we call that consolation. And so tears and sorrow might seem like they're not good things, but they're actually, in some cases, a form of consolation, because they help us see that we've been moving away from God, and with tears, we recognize a desire within to move back towards God, towards God's mercy. I'll offer an example from my own life. When I went through the 30-day spiritual exercises a few years ago, I experienced a point in the retreat of great sadness because I was thinking about how much I had hurt one of my best friends. But rather than drawing me away from God in that moment, I felt much closer to God in that sadness because I recognized I'd been ignoring God's invitation to love my best friend, and I felt God's mercy inviting me to do a different kind of love in my life. So in that moment, I didn't feel bad. I felt consoled, like God was inviting me to something more. The third experience that we call spiritual consolation is whenever we feel greater faith, hope, and love of God. In these moments, we feel a kind of expansiveness within, almost a welling up, where we feel greater trust of God. We believe in God's vision to transform the world and that there's a place for us within that vision. And we also want to give of ourselves more to God. We feel generous and we feel our hearts swelling within.
The fourth rule: if spiritual consolation is what we call movements that draw us towards God, then spiritual desolation is best summed up as movements that draw us away from God. Here are three typical experiences of desolation. First, we refer to desolation whenever we feel bogged down in turmoil, like we're in darkness and like we feel lost. A second experience of desolation is whenever we feel a lack of faith, hope, and love. When we feel like we cannot trust or feel despair or feel restless or apathetic towards serving God. When we feel this way, we want to avoid prayer or anything spiritual. Third, Ignatius tells us that the experience of desolation is the polar opposite of what we experience with consolation. When we are consoled, we feel a sense of our heart welling up within us to do good things for God, and we feel driven to do so. But when we're feeling desolate, we focus way too much on ourselves, and we're quick to despair. The thought of praising or serving God feels difficult in these moments. We'll get into some examples when we look at spiritual desolation in greater detail.
The next several rules help us understand spiritual desolation and consolation in a deeper way. So first, we'll take a look at some rules around desolation, and then later, some rules about consolation. The fifth rule is about how often we find ourselves in spaces of feeling desolation, and we can feel a temptation to change a decision that we've already made or to make a new decision based on how we're feeling desolate. The false spirit in this case is doing what we discussed earlier in the second rule. When we are moving in the direction of the good, especially after making good decisions in our lives, the false spirit seeks to throw roadblocks in the way, to confuse us, to get us second-guessing ourselves. Because remember, the false spirit is the enemy of God's Spirit and doesn't want us to follow God's Spirit. A couple years ago, I was a spiritual director for a student who was studying to be a nurse, and she was already pretty far along in her studies. In one of our sessions, this student mentioned that for several days, she was beginning to wonder if she really felt called to be a nurse. Whenever she thought about being a nurse, she felt kind of helpless, wondering if really she had what it takes to do it. There was a sense of darkness about it. She felt really confused, and she began to wonder if she was good at anything. She felt a lot of self-doubt and began to question about whether she should change her major to something else, even though she was far along in her studies. As she was talking, I immediately thought of previous sessions that I'd had with this same person. And she had told me several stories, including one where she was caring for an older woman, and she felt this deep sense of care for this woman, a deep sense of connection. And her work in the hospital with that woman felt like a confirmation of her desire to be a nurse. She'd felt peace. She'd felt what we would call consolation in that moment. I pointed this out to her, and I said, you know, it might be that you're in a space of what we'd call desolation. And it seemed in that moment like the false spirit was trying to knock her off track. She was feeling a deep sense of questioning because the false spirit was trying to undo the consolation she'd found in finding what she thinks is her vocation, what she's discerned to be her vocation in moments of consolation. So I advised the student to do what St. Ignatius advises in this fifth rule. In a time of desolation, don't make any new decisions. Hold on to the decision that occurred before the desolation came. And if we're feeling drawn away from God, such that we feel distant from Him, that's not the time to be making new decisions or to change old decisions.
And even though we shouldn't make big decisions when we're in a state of desolation, in the sixth rule, St. Ignatius says that we need to be actively working against this desolation. We shouldn't be passive. When we feel desolate, we often don't feel like praying or reflecting, but St. Ignatius teaches that we should aim to pray and reflect more when we feel this way.
So Ian, for you, it's kind of a personal question, but what do you do when you're in a spot of desolation yourself?
One of the ways I work against desolation is not only by taking my desolation into prayer. I talk to God about what I'm going through, about what's making me feel lost or like I'm bogged down. But I also talk about it with people who are close to me. I try to name the experience I'm going through. And whenever desolation feels especially dark, this practice of being transparent with others I'm close to is a way of inviting God's light into my life. It's a way of inviting that light to shine on this dark part of my life. And so that's actually a way to work against this desolation and is related to a later rule that we'll talk about as well.
The seventh rule is about the fact that you've probably picked up by now that desolation doesn't feel very good. You probably know this from your own experience. When we're in desolation, we struggle to feel a sense of God's presence, of God's love and support. It feels a lot like wandering through a desert, wandering and looking for water, but finding only sand. And we can begin to wonder if God has left us, abandoned us. But St. Ignatius points out that when we feel this way, we ought to still remember and trust that God has not abandoned us, even if we don't feel God's presence. A great example of this that perhaps you've heard about is after Mother Teresa died a few years ago, her prayer journals revealed that she endured years of this kind of dryness, of a sense of God's presence being absent from her life. And in a way, I think she exemplifies this rule because she continued to trust in God's faithfulness. She continued to do the work that she felt God had been calling her to do in a more consoling time earlier in her life. And I think she also exhibited the next rule that Ian's going to tell us about as well.
So the eighth rule, along with seeking to pray and reflect more when we feel desolate, St. Ignatius says that we need to cultivate an attitude of patience. This patience helps us to endure the challenges of feeling dry or distant from God, but also helps us remember and trust that we have had moments of consolation before and will have moments of consolation again. We may not feel this, but we can practice this trust, and that this is actually an act of faith, which is a movement back towards God. Overall, spiritual desolation is very uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable set of movements within us that we can feel for an extended period of time. And it raises the question, a question that maybe you wondering too. Why on earth would God allow us to feel this way?
It's clear that St. Ignatius asked that question and probably got that question from a lot of people, because he dedicates the 9th rule to attempting to answer it. It's important to note that he gives 3 reasons for why he thinks God allows desolation, but he doesn't say they're the only reasons, just maybe the most common ones that he's seen. The first reason is that the result of our own action, or maybe the lack of action. The first reason that we experience desolation and God allows it might be because we've been kind of lazy in our prayer. Our habits of praying daily have kind of fallen by the wayside. We've let busyness get in the way, or when we get to a time of the day where we usually pray, we just kind of decide to do something different. And as a result, spiritual desolation can rise within us. The second reason that St. Ignatius gives for why God might allow desolation is to test us, to test the depth and shape of our love for God. It's almost as if God is saying, do you only love me when you feel my presence? Which is a tough question. And I think most of us would have to answer that a lot of times in our lives, the answer is yes. So by allowing us to experience desolation, maybe God's inviting us to love him even when we feel like we're in the midst of darkness, or when we feel distant from him, when we feel dry, like we're in the middle of the desert. I think a good analogy for thinking about this is to think about relationships in our lives. If we're married or dating somebody, we know that there are times when we feel really great about the relationship. We feel a lot of joy, feel a lot of excitement about the other person. All we want to do is be around them. But we also know that there are times in relationships where we feel distant from the other. We feel like we're on a different page from them, and we're not really sure what to do about it. We know that those are often moments where our commitment is tested, where we are really in a position to ask ourselves, do I really love this person? And a lot of the time, we come out stronger for choosing to love somebody even when we don't feel it. The third reason for why God allows desolation, according to St. Ignatius, is to show us something very important. We don't control God. We don't control what God does for us or doesn't do for us. We're dependent in our entire life upon God. And when we're in desolation, we realize that in a real deep way. We realize that God freely gives us everything, including consolation. And so we can't make God show us consolation or give us consolation, but we can ask for it. We can ask for the grace of receiving that consolation, and when it comes, receive it with joy and with gratitude that God has given us this gift.
Ignatius' 10th rule for the discernment of spirits is all about storing up experiences of consolation in our heart. He writes that someone who is in consolation should recall that that consolation won't last forever. There will be a time when they're in desolation once more. This will help us move deeper into prayer and will be an encouragement against making drastic changes when in desolation. We store up these treasures so that we can bring them out later when we really need them. This is one of the reasons I like to keep a prayer journal. By recording experiences of God's closeness, I can revisit them on especially difficult days. And it's like Mary, I think, who in the Gospel of Luke after the birth of Jesus, when she hears what the angels have told the shepherds, it says that she kept all these things and pondered them in her heart. That's what the 10th rule is really all about.
The 11th rule is similar and also focuses on consolation. Ignatius advises that when we're in consolation, we should be humble. This goes back to something I said just a few moments ago, that everything we receive from God is a gift, and that includes consolation. There's nothing that we've done to earn it. And if we begin to think that we've earned it, that's something we might call spiritual pride. It's a state in which we can begin to think that because we are in a place of consolation, that we're somehow better than others because we're working to grow closer to God. But just as someone in consolation shouldn't big up themselves with pride, the person in desolation should practice trusting that God is providing grace that is sufficient to go on pursuing God's will. A person shouldn't let desolation make them so dejected that they give up on hope. We may experience this sort of temptation to despair when we're struggling with a particular sin that we've been struggling with for a long time, and maybe you've gone to confession about several times, but still can't break the habit. We can't be people seeking consolation if we lack hope. Hope is ultimately the way that we work past powerlessness and despair. The last 3 rules in Ignatius's Discernment of Spirits for the first week all give us analogies of how the false spirit works in a person's life.
In the 12th rule, we are given an image of the false spirit acting like a petulant child. We can think of a child who begs for a toy or a piece of candy when they're at the supermarket with their parents. If mom or dad isn't firm in their no, then the child will surely keep begging, pleading, or even demanding until their parents give in. Similarly, if we're not firm with our no when we experience temptation, the false spirit will surely keep acting as the child until it gets us to give in to this temptation.
In the 13th rule, St. Ignatius uses the image of a false lover. You might think of somebody who lures us into a relationship that we think is loving and intimate. But when it gets down to it, they don't want anybody else to know. They want it to be a secret. It's as if the lover is whispering in our ear, just listen to me and make sure to tell no one else. It's just between us. Ultimately, the person we thought was our lover is probably just manipulating us to do whatever she or he wants. Well, the false spirit acts similarly. It tries to get us to keep our temptations to ourselves, to remain in secrecy about them. And St. Ignatius teaches us that the best way to go against the false spirit in this case is to bring our temptations into the light, to bring them into the open by sharing them with somebody we trust. Certainly by bringing it up in prayer, but maybe talking to somebody that we know we can go to with something like this, a spiritual companion, a wisdom figure in our lives, maybe a pastor or a lay minister at our church.
And that 13th rule is really one of the reasons why I try to tell people when I'm in desolation, when I'm feeling bogged down, because when we share that with others, it is a way of inviting God in. Well, and finally, the 14th rule gives us an image of the false spirit as the commander of an army trying to conquer a walled city. That commander will send scouts to observe every part of the wall all around the city, looking for its weakest point. Similarly, the false spirit seeks to take advantage of our own weaknesses and predispositions. That's why it's important to have a deep knowledge of ourselves, which is the goal of our examine prayer, which we explained in one of our previous episodes.
Ian, we have just talked for a long time about a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I feel a little overwhelmed. I don't know if you're feeling a little overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, for folks who are watching or listening in, this might be the first time they're hearing about a lot of these rules, a lot of these ideas around consolation and desolation. Do you know of any resources that people could take a look at to kind of sit with this a little bit more and learn more?
Absolutely. There are a few. And again, a Google search for Discernment of Spirits will lead you to some good material. But actually, Guadalupe Media recently recorded a series on discernment with the superior of our community, Father Brian Christopher. And so that's a really good 5-part series of short 6-minute videos that explain discernment in a really helpful way and has Father Brian's nice, fun twist to it. And so definitely recommend going to that and watching that series. That'll help you deepen your understanding of what discernment is. And another good source is from another Jesuit brother of ours, a guy named Reynaldo. He's a Jesuit in formation. And he recently wrote an explainer on discernment for the website, thejesuitpost.org, which is a website that Dan and I both write for and produce content for. So we'll include a link for that. We encourage you. That's a short explainer. It's probably a 5-minute read and will really help you deepen your understanding of the discernment of spirits.
As always, at the end of our episode, we always ask a question, and of course, we invite you to think about this question yourself as we talk about it amongst ourselves. But the question today is very simple. Ian, favorite book of the Bible?
I think I really like Exodus. Of course, it's hard to choose a favorite book of the Bible, but Exodus is this great adventure story. It's the story of God saving the Hebrew people, the Israelites, and bringing them into the promised land, right? Leading Moses. So it's just a powerful story of how much God wants to free us from whatever it is that's keeping us down. And I think reading the story of Exodus also helps me understand how Christ wants to free me in my own life as well. And rather slavery to the Egyptians, it's slavery to sin in our own life, which is what we've been talking about, with the false spirit. So God wants to free us from the work of that false spirit, wants to guide us and draw us always closer into his heart. And I think Exodus is a good reminder for me of that. And for you, what's your favorite book of the Bible?
Similarly, it's a toss-up, but I would pick the Gospel of Luke. And the reason is there are stories that are unique to Luke that I find really moving and meaningful. The prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, but also the story at the very beginning in chapter 4 of Luke, where Jesus gets up and reads the scroll from Isaiah about proclaiming liberty to the captives, glad tidings to the poor, liberty to the captives. I just think that there's something very meaningful about the way in which Jesus is reaching out and embracing people in mercy and showing God's mercy. Of course, that's in every gospel, all 4, but I think there's a way in which it happens in Luke that I always find very meaningful and moving for me in my own spiritual life.
Well, great. We want to thank you for joining us again this week for MAGISTALK. We invite you, if you have recommendations for topics to discuss or cover, please put them in the comment section when we're on Facebook or YouTube, or let Guadalupe Media know in some way. And we look forward to being with you again next week. Thanks, y'all.